Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You ever have one of those moments where everything just clicks? Where you realize in a single instant that you've been wasting your time on someone who never actually valued you? That happened to me the moment my boyfriend, whom I had been financially supporting, joked that I should compete for his attention against his female friends. I sat there, staring at this man whose rent I was paying, whose bills I was covering, while he smirked like it was all a big joke. That was the moment I decided I was done. But what happened after I left? Oh, he wasn't laughing anymore. When I first met Ethan, he had this effortless charm, the kind that made him the center of attention without even trying. He was laid back in a way that made everything seem easy, like life was just a series of moments meant to be enjoyed rather than taken too seriously. He had a boyish grin that made you want to believe the best in him, and when he looked at you, really looked at you, it felt like you were the most important person in the room. I fell for it hard. I told myself he was different, that this wasn't some shallow, surface-level attraction, that we had something real. The first few months were everything a new relationship was supposed to be. Late-night talks where we shared our dreams and fears, lazy Sundays curled up together watching movies, inside jokes that made us burst into laughter for no reason at all. I genuinely believed we were building something solid, something lasting. But as time passed, I started noticing little things, small cracks in the foundation that I brushed aside, telling myself I was just overthinking. Ethan had a lot of female friends, and I had no problem with that. I've never been the jealous type, never been the kind of woman who thinks men and women can't have friendships. But it wasn't just the fact that he had female friends. It was the way he acted around them, the way he seemed to light up when they walked into a room in a way he never did with me, the way he always made sure I knew how much fun he had with them. It felt intentional, like he wanted me to notice, like he wanted me to compete. And no matter how much I tried to shake the feeling, it kept creeping back in, making itself impossible to ignore. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining it. But then, there were moments that confirmed what I was too afraid to admit. Like the way he would cancel plans with me last minute, because someone needed his help, only for me to find out later that helping meant casually hanging out at a bar. Or the way he always seemed to have endless energy for his female friends, but acted exhausted when I asked for a real conversation about us. And then there was the way he talked about them, the casual comparisons, the subtle digs, the little comments designed to make me question myself. I should have confronted him sooner. I should have asked him outright why it felt like I was always being pushed into the background while he gave the best of himself to everyone else. But I kept quiet, kept trying to convince myself I was just being insecure, that I was making something out of nothing. Until one night, when he said something so absurd, so disrespectful, that it finally shattered the illusion I had been desperately clinging to. We were sitting on the couch, and I was exhausted. I had been working overtime for weeks, covering extra shifts at work, making sure the bills were paid. Not just mine, but his too. Ethan had been between jobs for months now, something he liked to call a temporary situation, but had made little effort to change. I wasn't just paying my half of the rent, I was covering everything, groceries, utilities, even small luxuries like his gaming subscriptions. And despite all of that, despite the fact that I was working myself to the bone to make sure we had a comfortable life, he barely seemed to see me anymore. So, I brought it up. I told him I felt like we hadn't gone on a real date in a long time, that I missed the way things used to be, that it felt like he wasn't present in our relationship anymore. I wasn't even angry when I said it, just tired of feeling like I was the only one trying, tired of feeling like I was giving everything while he gave nothing in return. He didn't even look up from his phone. He just leaned back against the couch, let out a small laugh, and with that infuriatingly smug grin I had once found charming, he said, "Maybe you should try competing a little. My female friends make a real effort to keep my attention." I froze. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him, thought maybe he was being sarcastic, thought maybe he was making some stupid joke that had come out wrong. I stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, waiting for him to realize how messed up that sounded. But he didn't. He just smirked, shrugged like it was no big deal, and went back to scrolling through his phone like nothing had happened. That was the moment something inside me shifted. It wasn't just about the words. It was about everything leading up to them. It was about how he had let me carry the weight of our entire life together without ever acknowledging the effort I was putting in. It was about how he had spent months making me feel like I had to prove myself to him while he sat back and enjoyed the benefits of my hard work. It was about how he had made it clear in a single sentence that he didn't see me as a priority, didn't value me, didn't think I was enough. I should have been angry. I should have screamed at him, thrown his phone across the room, demanded to know what the hell was wrong with him. But I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, staring at him, feeling this overwhelming sense of clarity wash over me. This man, the one I had been bending over backward for, the one I had been sacrificing for, the one I had been building a life with, was not my partner. He was not someone who respected me. He was not someone who saw me as an equal. And in that moment, I realized I was done. I didn't say a word. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain how deeply he had just hurt me. Because for the first time in a long time, I saw him for who he really was. And once you see someone clearly, there's no going back. The thing about that moment, the one where he told me to compete for his attention, was that it wasn't just about the words themselves. It was about everything leading up to it, every moment that had led me to that couch, every sacrifice I had made while he sat there acting as if I was just another person in his orbit. It was about the months I had spent keeping our lives together financially while he figured things out, about the times I had transferred rent money into his account without a second thought, about the groceries I had paid for while he tossed expensive snacks into the cart like money didn't mean anything. It was about the electricity bill, the internet bill, the streaming services, the small luxuries that he never once considered, never once acknowledged, never once thanked me for. I had done it because I cared, because I loved him, because I had convinced myself that relationships were about supporting each other through tough times, because I believed, deep down, that eventually he would get back on his feet and things would balance out. But the truth was, there had never been any balance. Not once, not since the moment he had lost his job and casually mentioned that he would need some help for a little while. That little while had turned into months, and every time I gently brought it up, every time I asked if he had been applying to new jobs, he would give me that same easygoing grin and say, yeah, I'm working on it. It's just been tough. And then, like clockwork, he would find something else to do. Playing games, hanging out with his female friends, spending his time on everything except fixing the situation that was putting all the responsibility on me. I thought about the times he had canceled on me last minute, telling me he was too tired to go out, that he just wanted a night in, that he needed some time to decompress. Only for me to later find out that he had spent the entire night drinking with his friends, laughing, posting pictures, making sure the whole world knew that he was still having the time of his life. I thought about the nights I had come home from work exhausted, only to find him sprawled out on the couch, a half-empty bag of chips next to him, the apartment a mess, the dishes piling up in the sink because he had been too busy to clean. And now, here he was, sitting next to me on the same couch I had paid for, under the roof I was keeping over our heads, smirking at me like I was some desperate girl begging for scraps of his attention. That night, I didn't say anything. I didn't argue. I didn't lash out or demand an explanation. Instead, I just lay next to him in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing while my mind replayed every single moment, every single red flag I had ignored, every single time my gut had told me that this wasn't love, that this wasn't a partnership, that I was investing while he was coasting. The realization settled over me slowly, like a weight pressing down on my chest, suffocating, undeniable. This wasn't a relationship. This was an arrangement. One where I gave, and he took. One where I worked, and he benefited. One where I sacrificed, and he expected more. I thought about the girl I had been when I first met him, the version of me that had been so excited about the future we were building together, the version of me that had believed in love, in partnership, in the idea that when two people cared about each other, they showed it through their actions. And then I thought about the girl I was now, the woman lying next to a man who had made me feel like I wasn't enough, like I had to earn his affection, like I had to compete for the privilege of being treated with basic respect. Something inside me just clicked. I didn't feel heartbroken. I didn't feel devastated. I didn't even feel angry, not in the way I expected to. Instead, I felt calm, clear, like I had been standing in the middle of a storm for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to see clearly. And now, finally, the storm had passed, and I could see everything for what it really was. I wasn't going to fight for a man who didn't even respect me. I wasn't going to beg for attention from someone who had made it clear that he valued the validation of others more than the love of the person keeping his life together. I wasn't going to keep sacrificing myself for a relationship that had been dead long before I had been ready to admit it. And most importantly, I wasn't going to warn him, because the difference between us, the thing that had taken me so long to understand, was that while he had spent months treating me like an option, like something he could take for granted, like someone who would always be there to pick up the pieces, he had never once considered what would happen if I walked away. But he was about to find out. The next morning, I woke up before him, the early sunlight streaming through the blinds as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding even though I wasn't afraid. I could hear him breathing beside me, completely oblivious, sleeping peacefully as if everything in his life was exactly the way he wanted it to be. And why wouldn't he? He had never felt the weight of responsibility, never had to wonder how the bills would be paid. never once worried about whether he was enough for me, because he had always assumed I would stay, that I would keep giving, keep sacrificing, keep letting him take and take and take without ever demanding anything in return. I got out of bed as quietly as possible, moving through the apartment with the kind of careful precision I had never needed before, because for the first time in our relationship, I wasn't doing something for him. I was doing something for me. I made coffee out of habit, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the bank app on my phone, scrolling through transaction after transaction, each one a reminder of just how much I had poured into this relationship, how much I had given while he had done nothing but expect more. Rent, groceries, streaming services, his gaming subscriptions, his takeout orders, the nights out he had with his friends that I had funded without even realizing it. It wasn't just about money. It was about what it represented. I thought about waking him up and confronting him, thought about shaking him and demanding to know why. Why had he treated me like I was disposable? Why had he been so comfortable using me while making me feel like I had to fight for his attention? Why had he let me carry the weight of our entire life together without even acknowledging the effort I was putting in? But then, just as quickly as the thought entered my mind, I pushed it away because I already knew the answer. He didn't care. He had never cared. And if he had, he wouldn't have needed me to spell it out for him. So I made a decision, one that had been forming in the back of my mind for weeks, one that now felt as inevitable as breathing. I wasn't going to argue with him. I wasn't going to explain myself. I wasn't going to cry or scream or beg him to see my worth, because the truth was, if he hadn't seen it by now, he never would. I was just going to leave, quietly, completely, permanently. I went to our shared bedroom and pulled out a suitcase, the sound of the zipper almost deafening in the stillness of the morning. I packed the essentials, my clothes, my documents, the things that mattered to me. I didn't take anything of his, didn't touch anything that wasn't mine, because I wanted him to wake up and see exactly what he had lost. I wanted him to walk into this apartment later and feel the absence of me, the emptiness of a life he had taken for granted. By the time I was done, my hands were shaking, but not from fear, from relief. I had already put down a deposit on a new place, had already made arrangements to transfer my half of the rent, so I wouldn't leave anything unpaid, because unlike him, I wasn't the kind of person who left someone else to clean up my messes. I took one last look around the apartment, not with sadness, not with nostalgia, but with clarity. And then, without a single word, without a single glance back, I walked out the door. It wasn't until later that afternoon that he finally noticed. The texts started rolling in one after another, his confusion evident in the way the messages shifted from mild annoyance to outright panic in a matter of minutes. "Where are you?" Then, "Babe, you forgot to pay the rent." Then, when he realized I hadn't forgotten, when it finally sank in that I had left, the messages turned desperate. "You can't just leave me like this. We need to talk. Please just come back so we can work this out." But I didn't respond, because for the first time in a long time, his problems weren't my responsibility. And I had never felt more free. At first, Ethan didn't take my leaving seriously, didn't believe for a second that I was actually gone for good, didn't even entertain the idea that I had finally decided I was done with him. In his mind, I was just mad, just upset, just overreacting to something small, something insignificant, something he assumed I would eventually get over once I calmed down. He had always operated under the belief that I was the one who needed him, that no matter what he did, no matter how selfishly he acted, no matter how much he took me for granted, I would always come back because that's what I had done in the past. He assumed I just needed space, assumed I would wake up one morning and miss him, assumed I would realize that I had overreacted and come crawling back, ready to apologize, ready to take him back, ready to resume my role as the woman who made his life easy. But what Ethan didn't realize, what he had never realized, was that I had already spent far too long pretending that I needed him, when the truth was that he had been the one who needed me. I had been the one keeping our lives together, the one covering the rent, the one making sure there was food in the fridge, the one making sure the bills got paid on time, the one handling everything while he coasted through life without a single concern about how any of it was being managed. He had convinced himself that I needed him, when in reality, he had built his entire lifestyle on me. The first few days after I left, I could tell he was still in denial, still convinced that this was just some temporary break, still confident that I would come to my senses. His messages were casual at first, almost playful, almost as if he thought he could charm his way back into my life with that same smug confidence that had once made me fall for him. "Hey babe, you good? Haven't heard from you. You just needed some space, right?" Then another, "You want to grab dinner and talk about things? I think we're both overthinking this." It was almost laughable how little he understood the situation, how much he truly believed that I was just waiting for him to say the right words so I could come running back like nothing had happened. But then a week passed, then two, and suddenly reality hit him hard. The rent was due, the bills needed to be paid, and for the first time since I had met him, Ethan had to face the harsh truth that he was responsible for his own life. His easy, comfortable existence. The one I had been providing for him. The one he had taken for granted. The one where he could spend his days lounging around, going out with his friends, ignoring every real responsibility, was slipping right through his fingers. That was when the desperate calls started. At first, it was voicemails that still carried a hint of arrogance, like he was doing me a favor by reaching out, like this was still something he could control. "Babe, I messed up, okay? Just talk to me. We can work this out." But when I didn't respond, when I let his messages pile up without giving him a single ounce of my attention, his tone started to shift, started to crack, started to sound less like the man who thought he was untouchable and more like the man who was realizing just how much he had lost. "You're really going to let me lose the apartment?" The same apartment that I had been paying for while he sat there, laughing about making me compete for him. He was panicking now, spiraling, realizing far too late that the life he had been living wasn't sustainable without me, that the security he had taken for granted wasn't something he had built himself, that everything he had was because I had been the one keeping it together. And now, with me gone, with my financial support gone, with my patience gone, with my willingness to fix his problems gone, he was finally seeing what it was like to live without the safety net he had never appreciated. But I didn't respond. Not because I didn't hear him, not because I didn't see his messages stacking up, not because I didn't understand exactly what was happening on his end, but because I had already given him enough of my time, my energy, my effort, my money. I had spent months pouring everything I had into someone who had made it clear that he didn't value it. And now that I was finally gone, he wanted my attention? He had already taken everything from me. I wasn't about to give him any more. In the weeks that followed my departure, I didn't have to go searching for updates about Ethan's situation because the news had a way of finding me, slipping into my life through mutual friends, casual conversations, and social media posts that painted a very different picture from the carefree life he had once enjoyed. Word spread quickly, and even though I had no desire to keep tabs on him, I found myself hearing about him without even trying, his name appearing in conversations like a ghost from a past life that I no longer had any attachment to. Apparently, reality had hit him harder than he had ever expected, and the moment the first of the month rolled around, the real consequences of his actions had come knocking at his door, literally. Without my income covering the rent, without my money keeping his lifestyle afloat, without my patience ensuring that everything ran smoothly, everything in his life had started unraveling much faster than he could handle. The landlord, who had never once needed to chase us down for a payment while I was the one handling everything, was suddenly no longer willing to wait for excuses, no longer accepting delayed plans, no longer tolerating the carefree attitude Ethan had always carried when it came to responsibility. The grace period was over, the fantasy had ended, and now, with nothing to fall back on, Ethan was finally being forced to face something he had never had to before, the consequences of his own choices. At first, he did what I expected him to do. He bluffed. He acted like everything was fine, pretended he was figuring it out, told himself and anyone who would listen that he had things under control, that I had just been dramatic for leaving, that he would bounce back in no time. But the problem was, bouncing back required something that Ethan had never built: independence. And without me there to handle everything for him, without me there to pick up the pieces, without me there to smooth over the messes he created, he was left with nothing but himself, and that was never going to be enough to keep his life together. For the first time, he had to look around and realize that all the people he had put before me, all the people whose attention he had valued so much, all the people he had expected to show up for him when things got hard, were suddenly nowhere to be found. He reached out to his friends, the same ones he had prioritized over me, the same ones whose attention he had smugly told me to compete for, the same ones who had been more important to him than the woman keeping his life together. But what he didn't realize, what he had never understood, was that those friendships had never been built on real loyalty. They had been built on convenience. Ethan had been fun to be around when he had nothing to worry about, when he had a comfortable life that I had been maintaining, when he could afford to be the guy who never stressed about money, when he could go out drinking, stay up late, crash on a couch, and wake up with no real responsibilities waiting for him. But now that his world was falling apart, now that he actually needed real help, suddenly all of those people had other commitments. Suddenly they were too busy. Suddenly their messages weren't being answered. Suddenly their invitations to go out had dried up completely. No one was offering him a place to crash. No one was offering to spot him until he got back on his feet. No one was going out of their way to make sure he was okay. He had assumed that if things ever got rough, he could count on them the way he had always been able to count on me. But what he had never realized was that I had been the only person who had ever actually been there for him. And now that I was gone, now that his safety net had vanished, he was starting to realize far too late that he had bet everything on the wrong people. The irony of it all wasn't lost on me. The man who had expected me to fight for his attention, the man who had treated my love like it was disposable, the man who had smirked at me from the couch I had paid for and told me that his female friends made more of an effort, was now fighting to get anyone to care about his problems. His little kingdom had crumbled, his audience had moved on, and now, with no one left to impress, no one left to entertain, no one left to manipulate, he was standing in the wreckage, finally seeing his life for what it truly was. And me? I was watching from a distance, not with anger, not with hatred, not with malice, but with the cold, detached satisfaction that comes from knowing that some people don't deserve a dramatic confrontation, don't deserve a second chance, don't deserve a moment of your time trying to make them understand. Some people don't need you to teach them a lesson. Life will do that for you. And Ethan? He was learning the hard way. After weeks of being ignored, weeks of unanswered texts, weeks of watching his life slowly crumble while I stayed silent, Ethan finally switched tactics, no longer playing the confident, smug man who believed he had control over the situation, no longer acting like I would come running back the moment I realized how much I supposedly needed him. He went from arrogance to pity, from pretending he was fine without me to outright begging for my attention, from acting as if I had overreacted to suddenly acting as if I was his only hope. The messages, which had once been cocky, dismissive, and full of attempts to downplay what had happened, became something else entirely desperate. At first, the shift was subtle, almost as if he didn't want to fully admit that he was spiraling, almost as if he was still trying to save face, still holding on to some small shred of dignity. But the more I ignored him, the worse it got, the more obvious it became that he wasn't just struggling, he was drowning. The messages started piling up again, but this time, they weren't angry, weren't condescending, weren't the usual attempts to twist the situation into something that made me feel guilty. Instead, they were panicked, disjointed, full of excuses and half-hearted attempts to shift the blame onto anything but himself. I know I messed up, okay? But you just left without even giving me a chance to fix things. I'm sorry about what I said. I didn't mean it that way. I was just joking, you know that. I'm going to lose the apartment. I don't have anywhere else to go. You really want to do this to me? That last one made me pause, but not for the reason he probably expected. It wasn't guilt that I felt, wasn't some overwhelming sense of regret, wasn't even the faintest temptation to help him. No, what I felt in that moment was disbelief, because even now, after everything that had happened, after I had walked away from him, after he had been forced to face the consequences of his own actions, he still refused to acknowledge that he was the one who had done this to himself. He actually thought I was doing this to him, actually believed that I was the reason he was in this mess, actually convinced himself that I was the one responsible for his downfall, as if he had played no part in his own destruction, as if I had just randomly decided to ruin his life without warning. It was almost laughable, almost ridiculous how little self-awareness he had, how he still couldn't see the truth even when it was staring him in the face, how he still refused to take responsibility for anything. For months, I had kept him afloat, had carried the weight of our relationship on my shoulders, had paid his rent, had bought his food, had made sure he had everything he needed while he treated me like I was lucky to be with him. And now, the second I was gone, the second I stopped playing my role as his personal safety net, his entire world had collapsed around him. And somehow, he was the victim? Somehow, I was the one to blame? I didn't respond. Not once. Not even to tell him off. Not even to remind him of all the ways he had taken advantage of me. Not even to give him the satisfaction of knowing that I had read his pathetic attempts at manipulating me. I wasn't going to waste a single second of my time giving him an explanation, wasn't going to give him the closure he was so desperately searching for, wasn't going to let him twist this into something it wasn't. Because the truth was, he didn't deserve an explanation. He had already shown me exactly who he was when he sat on that couch, under the roof I had been paying for, and laughed in my face, telling me that I needed to compete for his attention, as if my love, my loyalty, my sacrifice had never been enough, as if I was just another option in a long list of people he could replace the second I stopped being useful to him. He had already shown me exactly who he was when he let me carry him without ever once stopping to acknowledge what I was doing for him, without ever once asking if I was okay, without ever once treating me like a partner instead of a convenience. So no, I wasn't going to respond, because for the first time in my life, I didn't know him anything. And for the first time in his life, he was going to have to figure out how to survive on his own. I truly believed I was done with him. Believed that my silence had spoken louder than any words ever could. Believed that ignoring his texts and calls would be enough to send the message that I was gone, that I wasn't coming back, that he had burned every last bridge and there was nothing left for him to salvage. But men like Ethan never accept consequences easily, never take responsibility for their own downfall, never allow themselves to believe that the person they relied on the most could actually walk away and leave them to fend for themselves. And so, even after weeks of my absence, even after watching his life crumble around him, even after losing the comfort and security I had once provided, he still wasn't ready to let go. I came home from work that evening, exhausted but at peace, finally settling into a life where I no longer had to carry someone else's burdens, finally enjoying the freedom of a space that belonged only to me, finally living a life where every dollar I made, every choice I made, every single thing I did was for myself instead of for someone who had never appreciated it. But as I approached my building, something felt off. A presence that didn't belong, an unwelcome shadow lingering where it had no right to be. And then I saw him, standing outside my apartment building, looking exhausted, disheveled, and desperate in a way I had never seen before. His posture slumped, his clothes wrinkled, his entire demeanor so different from the cocky, confident man I had once known. For a brief second, I almost didn't recognize him, almost couldn't reconcile the person standing in front of me with the man I had left behind, the man who had smirked at me while I paid his rent, the man who had dismissed me like I was just another fixture in his life instead of the one thing keeping him from falling apart. This wasn't the Ethan I had walked away from. This was someone who had been backed into a corner, someone who had burned every bridge and was now trying to crawl his way back across the ashes, someone who had finally realized what he had lost. His eyes met mine the moment I stopped in my tracks, and for a moment, neither of us said anything, just standing there, frozen in the heavy silence of everything that had led to this moment. Everything that had unraveled since the last time we had spoken. He shifted on his feet, exhaling heavily, rubbing a hand over his face like he was trying to collect himself, like he was trying to figure out the best way to approach me, like he still thought there was something he could say that would make me change my mind. "Can we just talk?" he finally asked, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. None of the usual arrogance, none of the usual confidence, just raw desperation, just the sound of a man who had lost everything and knew, deep down, that he was the only one to blame. I didn't move, didn't step closer, didn't invite him in, didn't let him inside the walls of the life I had built without him. Didn't give him even the slightest indication that there was anything left to salvage. "There's nothing left to talk about, Ethan," I said, my voice steady, my resolve unshaken. Unwilling to give him the satisfaction of thinking he still had even the smallest piece of me left to manipulate. He sighed, his shoulders slumping further, his entire body seeming to cave in on itself as he realized that I wasn't going to make this easy for him, that I wasn't just going to forgive him because he had finally figured out what I had known all along. "I don't have anywhere to go," he admitted, finally dropping the act, finally saying the words he had been trying to avoid, finally laying his reality bare in front of me. "I screwed up? Okay. I know that now. I need help." For a moment, there was nothing but silence between us, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air, the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on both of us, the weight of every choice he had made leading up to this exact moment. Then, finally, I looked him in the eyes, stared straight into the face of the man who had once made me feel like I wasn't enough, the man who had once believed I would always be there to pick up the pieces of his life, the man who had spent months taking until there was nothing left for me to give. And I said the words he never expected to hear from me. "That's not my problem." He flinched like I had slapped him, his expression crumbling, his mouth opening, then closing, as if he was searching for a way to twist the situation, searching for a way to manipulate me, searching for a way to say just the right thing that would make me hesitate, make me doubt, make me care again. But there was nothing left to twist, nothing left to manipulate, nothing left for him to hold on to, because I'd already won. Not by revenge, not by some grand act of vengeance, not by getting even, but simply by walking away and refusing to play his game. I watched as the realization hit him. Watched as he finally understood that there were no second chances, no do-overs, no way for him to fix this, no magic words that would undo everything he had done. And for the first time since I had left, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of being alone, not fear of losing his apartment, not fear of struggling without me, but fear of irrelevance. Fear of knowing that I had moved on, fear of knowing that I had built a life without him and that he no longer mattered to me. Without another word, without giving him even a single second of false hope, I turned and walked inside, shutting the door behind me, cutting off whatever pathetic excuse he had been about to make, cutting off whatever plea had been forming in his mind, cutting off him from my life completely. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Looking back on everything that had happened, on all the time I had wasted, on all the energy I had poured into a man who never once truly appreciated what I had done for him, I could honestly say that I didn't regret a single thing about walking away. For so long, I had convinced myself that relationships were about sacrifice, about patience, about supporting each other through the hard times, about waiting for someone to change. But the truth was, real love doesn't make you beg for respect. Real love doesn't demand that you set yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm. I had spent months carrying the weight of a relationship that was never built to last, months believing that if I just tried harder, if I just gave a little more, if I just proved myself enough, then maybe he would finally start to see me, to choose me, to appreciate me the way I had always deserved. But the harsh truth was that Ethan had never wanted to change, had never intended to change, had never planned to be anything more than the man he had always been, careless, entitled, selfish, and completely incapable of taking responsibility for his own life. He had built his entire existence around the assumption that I would always be there, that I would always forgive, that I would always stay, no matter how much he took me for granted, no matter how much he ignored my needs, no matter how many times he made me feel like I wasn't enough. He had believed, until the very last moment, that I needed him more than he needed me, that I would miss him, that I would eventually realize my mistake and come crawling back. But he had been wrong, so wrong. I had walked away without anger, without spite, without even the need for revenge, because the most satisfying revenge wasn't getting even. It was moving on. It was living my life without him, thriving without him, proving to myself that I had never needed him in the first place, that everything I had given him, all the effort, all the care, all the love, had always been wasted on someone who never deserved it. And the moment I shut that door in his face, the moment I left him standing there completely and utterly alone, was the moment I won. The best part was that the more time passed, the more I realized how much lighter I felt, how much happier I was without him, how much peace I had now that I wasn't constantly worrying about someone who never worried about me. My days no longer revolved around stressing over unpaid bills that weren't mine, no longer revolved around waiting for a man who never showed up for me emotionally, no longer revolved around questioning my own worth because he refused to acknowledge it. For the first time in years, I was completely and entirely free. And then one day, out of nowhere, I got a message from a mutual friend, someone who had once defended Ethan, someone who had once tried to convince me that he wasn't that bad, someone who had once said, maybe he just needs time to grow up. But this time, the message wasn't about making excuses for him, wasn't about trying to guilt me into reconsidering, wasn't about trying to make me feel bad for leaving. It was a single sentence, short, to the point, almost amused in its delivery. You were right about him. That was it. No explanation, no context, just those 5 words, but that was all I needed to know. I didn't even ask for details because I didn't care, didn't need confirmation that Ethan had continued to be the person I had always known him to be, didn't need to hear how he had crashed and burned without me, didn't need to know how many more people had finally seen through him the way I had. Because the truth was, Ethan had always been his own worst enemy, and I had simply stepped out of the way and let him face himself without the safety net I had been providing. If there was one thing I had learned from all of this, one thing I would carry with me for the rest of my life, it was that love is not a transaction, that relationships should never be built on one person giving everything while the other takes without a second thought. If someone truly values you, if someone genuinely cares about you, you will never have to fight for their attention, will never have to beg for their effort, will never have to prove to them that you are worthy of respect. Love should never feel like a competition, should never feel like a burden, should never make you feel less than you are. So to anyone out there who has ever felt like they weren't enough for someone who never deserved them, to anyone who has ever questioned their worth because of a partner who made them feel invisible, to anyone who has ever stayed in a relationship out of obligation, out of hope, out of the belief that if I just try harder, maybe they'll change, please hear me when I say this. You do not have to prove your worth to anyone. You do not have to fight for love that should be freely given. You do not owe your time, your energy, or your life to someone who refuses to treat you with the respect you deserve. Sometimes the best thing you can do isn't to argue, isn't to demand they see your value, isn't to force them to change. Sometimes the best thing you can do is walk away and never look back.